The cord tightened around my throat so suddenly that the world tilted into a blur of panic and pain, and in that moment I understood that my own sister wanted me dead. My fingers clawed at the rough surface of the cable, digging into my skin, the pressure crushing my windpipe until every breath became a ragged gasp. My eyes bulged as black spots swirled in my vision, and the sound of my heartbeat thundered so loudly that it drowned out everything except her voice. Melissa leaned over me, her teeth clenched, her eyes wide with a rage that had no bottom, and she screamed into my face, "You deserve nothing! You took everything from me!" The words hit harder than the cord itself because they were not new. They were an echo of years of jealousy and bitterness that had been brewing inside her, but tonight she had chosen to let it boil over into something physical, something deadly. My body thrashed against hers, my nails scratched at her wrists, but she only pulled tighter and my lungs burned as if fire itself had ignited inside my chest. I tried to cry out for help, but no sound came, only a faint wheeze that was swallowed in the airless room. The smell of sweat and dust from the carpet filled my nose as she forced me down her knee, pinning my ribs until they felt like they would snap. My vision flickered, the edges turning dark, and I knew I was seconds away from collapsing entirely. Somewhere in the chaos, a thought pierced through clear and cold. If I give up now, no one will ever know the truth. She will say, "I deserved it," and our parents will believe her, just like always. That thought lit a final spark of survival. With what strength I had left, I pushed my heels against the floor, arching my body backward with all the desperation of someone drowning beneath waves, and slammed us both against the wall. The shock of the impact loosened her grip for just a heartbeat, but a heartbeat was all I needed. Air rushed in like knives through my raw throat, and I twisted my body sideways, dragging the cord over my shoulder. Melissa shouted in frustration, her voice sharp and unhinged. "You think you can win, Emily? You think you are stronger, but you are nothing." Her words mixed with the sound of my choking breaths, the room spinning as if the walls themselves recoiled from what she had done. My knees buckled. I staggered toward the desk, one hand clutching my bruised neck. I could taste iron at the back of my throat, my skin slick with sweat, but I refused to fall. Not in front of her, not when she wanted to see me broken. She lunged again, her hands reaching for the cord to wrap it once more around me, and for a second, I thought it would end here, but my arm flung wildly and knocked the lamp from the desk. The crash sent shards of glass scattering across the floor, and the sudden noise finally drew attention from outside. Footsteps rushed toward the door, my parents' voices cutting through the thick air. "What is going on in there?" Melissa's face changed instantly like a mask snapping into place, her fury replaced with crocodile tears. She released the cord, letting it drop to the floor, and collapsed to her knees, sobbing as if she were the victim. She hit herself lightly on the arm to create red marks, then looked at me with a twisted smile hidden beneath her fake cries, ready to spin her story. The door burst open, and our parents stared, their eyes first going to her trembling and weeping, then to me with my swollen neck gasping for breath. Before I could form words, Melissa wailed. She attacked me first. She tried to hurt me. I was just defending myself. Their faces hardened with disbelief, directed not at her, but at me. The room tilted again this time, from the betrayal that was older than the bruises forming on my skin. I tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, and all I saw was my mother's frown and my father's silence, both already deciding whose side they were on. That night, as I lay on the floor with the cord coiled beside me like a snake waiting to strike again, I realized that this was no longer about arguments or favoritism. My sister had crossed the line into attempted murder, and my parents had chosen once again to look away. What none of them knew was that this time the evidence would not disappear. This time the truth would not be buried under her lies. This time there would be proof carved into my body that no one could deny, and when it came out it would change everything. My name is Emily Carter. I am 22 years old, and until that night when my sister's hands tightened a cord around my throat, I believed that the worst thing my family could do to me was dismiss me, belittle me, or pretend my existence mattered less than hers. The attack was shocking, but it was not born out of nowhere. It was the inevitable result of years spent in a house where love was rationed like food, where every slice was handed to Melissa first, while I was expected to survive on scraps. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary suburban family, a modest home. Two daughters, close in age parents who attended church on Sundays and smiled for holiday photos. But beneath that thin layer of normalcy was a structure built on favoritism, control, and silence. My parents, Richard and Diane, had a vision of what a daughter should be. Graceful, confident, admired by neighbors, and Melissa fit that mold perfectly. She was 4 years older, beautiful in a way that demanded attention loud enough to fill every room, and bold enough to claim anything she wanted. When she danced in school recitals, my mother would sit in the front row with tears in her eyes, clapping until her hands were red, while my father would beam with pride and talk about how she was destined for great things. When I came home with perfect grades or a ribbon from a science fair, they would barely glance up from the television, muttering something like, "Good job," before moving on as if effort and achievement were expected from me, but never worthy of celebration. I was the quiet one. The one who stayed up late reading, who preferred sketching in notebooks or helping in the library instead of competing for attention. My mother would shake her head when she saw grease on my hands from working a shift at the diner and say, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" My father rarely corrected her, his silence reinforcing her words until they became truth, carved into the walls of our home. As children, Melissa and I should have been allies, but instead, she learned quickly that she was the favorite and she wielded it like a weapon. If she wanted my toys, she took them. If she broke something, I was blamed. If she failed a test, I was the one scolded for not helping her study. It was a cycle that grew with us, twisting tighter with every year, leaving me more and more invisible. By the time I entered high school, I realized I could never win their approval by competing on her battlefield. So I turned inward. I poured myself into my studies, into long nights at the diner, and early mornings tutoring, determined that one day I would build a life beyond their reach. My dream was not glamorous, not something they would understand, but it mattered to me. I wanted to become a nurse, to dedicate my life to helping people who had no one else, because I knew too well what it felt like to be overlooked. That dream carried me through exhaustion, through the ache of being told again and again that I was not enough. It gave me a reason to rise above the noise of Melissa's endless demands and my parents' dismissive sighs. Yet even as I built that fragile independence, I still returned home, still sat at the dinner table where Melissa's voice drowned mine out, still heard my mother's criticisms and my father's silence, because walking away entirely from your family is harder than it sounds. I clung to the hope that maybe one day they would see me for who I was, that maybe my sacrifices would matter. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was the shadow in a house that belonged to her. The attack with the cord did not appear from thin air. It was only the physical embodiment of the hatred that had been simmering for years, the hatred that had been fed by our parents' blindness and fueled by Melissa's belief that she was untouchable. When I think back to childhood, the memories that should have been warm are always edged with coldness, because from the very beginning, Melissa was the golden child while I was the afterthought. She was born first arriving with fanfare, and the story of her birth was retold every year with glowing detail: how beautiful she was, how perfect, how the neighbors came to see her like a little princess. When I came along 4 years later, the story was shorter, quieter, almost as if I had been an accident or a chore that my parents endured rather than a blessing they celebrated. I grew up watching the difference between us, not only in the way they spoke to us, but in every material thing. Melissa's closet was full of brand new clothes, frilly dresses for holidays, the latest sneakers for school, while mine was stuffed with her hand-me-downs that still carried her perfume or the faint smell of nail polish remover. When she wanted ballet classes at 6, my mother signed her up at the most expensive studio in town, proudly driving her to lessons 3 times a week and bragging about her progress. When I asked for art supplies or wanted to join a summer reading camp, I was told money was tight, that such things were luxuries we could not afford. The same story repeated itself at birthdays. Melissa got lavish parties with balloons, decorations, 50 guests, music, and cakes layered high with frosting. When I turned 16, I received a card and a store-bought cake with my name spelled wrong. I smiled anyway, because that was what was expected of me, and my mother said, "Be grateful, Emily, you always want too much." Even in education, the gap was obvious. Melissa struggled in school, but each time she came home with poor grades, our parents' hired tutors sat with her at the table, encouraged her, promised she was smart. When I excelled, staying up late and pushing myself, they shrugged as if excellence was natural for me, and therefore not worthy of acknowledgement. Once I won first place at the county science fair, standing proudly with my project in front of judges and classmates, but my parents did not even attend. They were busy at Melissa's cheerleading competition. I held the ribbon alone, the applause ringing hollow in the absence of the people I most wanted to see. Perhaps the most painful memory of favoritism came when I was 10. I had developed a fever so high that my head spun and my body shook. I begged my mother to take me to the hospital, but she said, "Melissa has her recital tonight. We cannot miss it. You will be fine." She gave me a glass of water and tucked a blanket around me, then left me sweating and shivering while she and Dad drove Melissa to the auditorium. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling, wondering if I even mattered to them at all. Melissa understood the favoritism as well as I did, but instead of showing sympathy, she wielded it like a weapon. If she broke something, she would point at me and say I did it, and my parents would believe her. If she wanted a toy or a book, she would take it, and when I cried, my mother said, "Let her have it. You need to learn to share." If she failed a test, she would tell them I had not helped her, and I would be scolded for being selfish. I was not her sister in those moments. I was her scapegoat, and she thrived on it. The message was clear. She was entitled to everything, and I was expected to sacrifice. The unfairness sank deep into me, becoming part of my bones, teaching me early that love in my family was conditional, reserved for the daughter who fit their image of perfection. By the time I reached middle school, I had stopped expecting fairness, but that did not stop the hurt. I stopped asking for new clothes. I stopped telling them about my achievements because I knew the answer would be silence or dismissal. Still, a small part of me longed for a smile of approval. A word of praise, some sign that I was not invisible. It never came. Instead, Melissa grew bolder, flaunting her position as favorite. She would taunt me with whispers, saying things like, "They love me more, they always will." And when I protested, she laughed because she knew it was true. These years carved me into the person I would become, resilient but deeply scarred, carrying the weight of neglect on my shoulders. They also planted the seed of determination, a stubborn refusal to be erased. If my family would not value me, then I would create my own worth elsewhere. But that resolve came only after years of tears cried quietly in the dark, after endless nights wondering why I was never enough, after realizing that the love I wanted from them was not coming. The favoritism was not just unfair, it was the foundation of everything that would follow, the soil in which resentment and rage grew, the stage on which Melissa learned that she could do anything and still be defended. By the time I reached high school, I realized that waiting for fairness from my parents was like waiting for rain in the desert, so I decided to stop waiting and start building my own escape. While Melissa coasted through adolescence on an endless stream of allowances, compliments, and rescue missions from Mom and Dad, I turned inward, focusing on what I could control: my grades, my work ethic, and my dream of leaving. I took on every part-time job I could find, washing dishes at the diner on weekends, babysitting in the evenings, stocking shelves at the local pharmacy during summer. I would come home exhausted, grease on my shirt, my feet aching, but every dollar tucked into my savings jar was a silent promise that I was one step closer to freedom. My parents never noticed or asked how I managed. They were too busy funding Melissa's whims, paying for new clothes, new phones, or whatever drama she invented to get more attention. But I noticed. I noticed the way I was changing, the way the long hours toughened me, the way being dismissed fueled me instead of breaking me. School was my other battlefield, and there I excelled with a relentless drive. While Melissa barely passed her classes, I stayed up until midnight completing assignments, reading textbooks, pushing myself because I knew education was my ticket out. I graduated near the top of my class, earning a scholarship to a state university, and though my parents did not even attend the ceremony, I stood on that stage knowing that I had carved my own path without their applause. At university, I chose nursing not just because I wanted stability, but because I wanted meaning. I had known what it felt like to be neglected, to have pain ignored, and I swore that if I could ease the suffering of others, then my own suffering would not have been for nothing. My professors noticed my determination. I volunteered for extra shifts during clinicals. I asked questions. I studied until my eyes burned. My classmates went to parties. I worked night shifts as a caregiver, my body running on caffeine and stubbornness. Some nights I cried from exhaustion, but each time I thought of Melissa sleeping comfortably in her old bedroom, while Mom folded her laundry, I pushed myself harder. I knew that I could not rely on anyone else to save me, so I became my own savior. Even when I earned small victories, such as being praised for my care during clinical rotations or receiving extra scholarships, I did not share them at home. I had learned the hard way that news of my achievements either went ignored or, worse, twisted into comparisons that made Melissa resent me more. Instead, I carried those victories inside, building a quiet armor of self-worth. I dreamed of the day when I would graduate, secure a stable job, and move far away, perhaps across the country, to a place where their voices could no longer reach me. Each time I walked past the medical library, inhaling the scent of books and determination, I promised myself that I would never be trapped by their favoritism again. But ambition came at a cost. I missed out on the carefree years other students had. I skipped vacations, declined invites, worked every holiday. My hands grew rough, my back sore, my bank account modest but growing. Still beneath the exhaustion was pride. I was building something no one could take from me, or so I thought. What I did not know was that while I labored to create a future, Melissa's jealousy fermented and my parents' blind indulgence hardened. They could not stand to see me succeed. Without their permission, could not accept that I was carving an identity outside their control. My independence, the very thing I had fought so hard to achieve, would become the spark for the violence that nearly ended my life. In the bleakness of my family life, where favoritism suffocated me and Melissa's shadow stretched over everything, there were still a few lights that kept me from sinking completely, people whose belief in me reminded me that I was not invisible to everyone. The first was my grandfather George, my father's father, who had lived only a few blocks away until his passing when I was 16. Unlike my parents, he had a way of seeing me, really seeing me as if my quietness was not weakness but depth, as if my hard work was not just expected but admirable. He used to call me his little survivor, saying that while others in the family were loud and dramatic, I had a strength that was steady, the kind of strength that lasted. On Saturdays, I would walk to his house and he would make us tea, letting me sit in silence until I was ready to talk. He never pressured, never compared me to Melissa. Instead, he asked about my drawings, my grades, my dreams. When I told him at 14 that I wanted to be a nurse, he nodded with quiet pride and said, "That makes sense. You have always been the one who notices pain." His validation became an anchor, and when he died of a heart attack 2 years later, I felt as though the only true advocate I had in the family was gone. Still, the memory of his words carried me through nights when I thought I could not keep pushing. The second light appeared in college when I met Daniel. He was in his junior year studying biomedical sciences, tall, kind-eyed, with a patience that matched my own exhaustion. We met at the library when I dropped a stack of books and he knelt to help me gather them, laughing softly instead of mocking me. Conversation bloomed easily, and within weeks, he knew more about me than most of my relatives ever had. Daniel listened when I explained the imbalance at home, when I recounted how Melissa twisted every story and how my parents sided against me. He did not dismiss it or try to minimize it. Instead, he said, "Emily, that is abuse. You know that, right?" It was the first time someone used that word, and it jolted me, but it also opened my eyes to the truth. Abuse was not only bruises, it was neglect, dismissal, and the refusal to protect me. With Daniel, I did not have to fight to be heard. He celebrated my victories, small as they were, bringing me coffee during late-night study sessions, clapping when I got an A on a brutal exam, holding my hand when exhaustion made me cry. Unlike Melissa, he did not see my strength as a threat. He saw it as something to admire. Unlike my parents, he did not resent my ambition. He encouraged it. He became the family I wished I had, proof that love could be gentle, supportive, and unconditional. There was also Mrs. Henderson, a professor in the nursing program who recognized my dedication. She offered me research assistant work that paid enough to cover part of my rent and mentored me through the toughest semesters. She reminded me of my grandfather in the way she noticed the quiet students, the way she encouraged us to believe that compassion was power. These allies may have been few, but they shaped my survival. They gave me a glimpse of what healthy relationships could look like, a contrast so sharp against the backdrop of my toxic family that I could not ignore it. Their presence made it clear that Melissa and my parents were not the whole world, that outside of their grasp was a place where respect and fairness existed. It was those voices, my grandfather's memory, Daniel's support, and Mrs. Henderson's mentorship that whispered in my mind on the night Melissa tried to strangle me, reminding me that I was worth saving, reminding me that the truth once revealed would finally set me free. The turning point came quietly at first, as these things often do not, with violence, but with a conversation around the dinner table that should have been ordinary. I had come home for the weekend carrying my textbooks and my weary body after a week of exams and shifts at the hospital, hoping maybe for a few hours of peace. Melissa was already there, lounging in her old chair, as if she still lived in the house, scrolling on her phone and sighing dramatically every few minutes. Mom served dinner, chattering about renovations they wanted for the kitchen, while Dad nodded along. Mostly silent, his eyes tired from work. I had barely sat down when Melissa launched into a complaint about her job. She had been working as an assistant at a local marketing firm, her first real job since graduation, and predictably, she was already unhappy. She complained that her boss was unfair, that her coworkers did not appreciate her, that she deserved better pay and more respect. I listened in silence, pushing food around my plate until she dropped the line that made my blood run cold. She said she needed a break, maybe even a luxury vacation like her friends who were going on a Caribbean cruise. She tilted her head and looked at me with that smile she used when she was about to demand something, then said, "But I just cannot afford it on my salary. Life is so unfair, Emily. You are so lucky you have savings from all your jobs." My fork froze mid-air. I knew exactly where this was headed. Mom's eyes lit up as if she had already rehearsed the script, and she turned to me saying, "Emily, maybe you could help your sister. You have always been responsible with money, and she has been under so much stress. It would mean the world to her." My jaw clenched. That money was not for cruises, it was for tuition, for books, for the life I had been building out of sweat and exhaustion. I said quietly but firmly, "No, I need that money for school." Melissa's face darkened, her lips curling into a sneer. "You are so selfish," she spat. "You would let your own sister suffer just so you can hoard money for yourself." Dad cleared his throat, muttering that families should support each other, but his voice lacked conviction, and I realized they had already discussed this without me. They expected me to cave, to give in as always, to sacrifice my own needs for Melissa's comfort. But I did not. For the first time, I said, "I am not responsible for your choices, Melissa. If you want a vacation, work for it." The silence that followed was thick. My mother's glare sharp enough to cut my father's disappointment, radiating like heat. Melissa's eyes glittered with fury, a storm I knew too well, and she leaned across the table, hissing, "You will regret this!" I pushed back my chair, my hands trembling, and left the table without another word. That night, as I lay in the small bed of my childhood room staring at the ceiling, I replayed the scene again and again, the venom in her voice, the look on my parents' faces, the weight of their disapproval. Something inside me shifted. I had always known that they favored her, always known I was expendable in their eyes, but this time was different. This time I had drawn a line, and in their world lines were not allowed. The next day, when I packed to return to campus, Melissa stood in the doorway of my room, arms crossed, her expression cold. "You think you are stronger now?" she said softly. "You think you can stand against me? But you will see, Emily. You will see what happens when you do not give me what I want." Her words settled over me like a curse. I tried to brush them off, telling myself they were empty threats, but deep down I felt the tremor of something darker, something that would not stop at words. I did not know then that her resentment would soon twist into violence, that my refusal to fund her luxuries would become the spark that ignited her attempt to destroy me. The night it happened began like any other quiet on the surface, but humming with the tension that had been building since that dinner. I was back at home for a short visit because my clinical rotations did not start until the following week, and I had foolishly hoped that maybe a few days in familiar surroundings would not end in chaos. But Melissa had not forgotten my refusal. She had not forgiven what she saw as my betrayal, and in her mind, I had stolen something that was rightfully hers. It was late, the house was still, except for the ticking of the hallway clock, and I was in my room reviewing notes when the door slammed open so hard the frame shuddered. Melissa stormed in her face, red with fury, her hair disheveled, her breathing heavy, as though she had worked herself into a frenzy before even stepping inside. I stood up, startled, clutching my notebook against my chest, and asked her what she was doing. She did not answer with words. At first, she answered with action, yanking a cord from the lamp on the dresser and advancing with a look that froze me where I stood. Her voice cracked with rage as she shouted, "You think you can humiliate me? You think you can say no to me and walk away? Not in this house." Before I could react, she lunged, wrapping the cord around my throat with terrifying precision, pulling it tight until my breath disappeared in an instant. I clawed at the cord, my nails scraping my own skin in desperation, my lungs screaming for air, but she only pulled harder, her face inches from mine, twisted into something almost inhuman. "You ruined everything," she hissed. "You always wanted to be the favorite, but you will never be better than me." The words blurred into the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears, into the fire spreading across my chest. My legs buckled, my body thrashed, the room tilted, and I thought with sudden clarity that this was how I would die, not by accident or illness, but by the hands of my own sister. My eyes, filled with tears from the pressure spots of light, exploded across my vision, and I prayed silently for strength for one chance to fight back. Summoning the last of my energy, I jerked backward, slamming both of us against the wall. The impact loosened her grip just enough for me to gasp a shred of air, a jagged breath that burned my throat, and with trembling hands I pushed at her arms. But Melissa was relentless. She kneed me in the ribs, forcing a sharp crack that sent pain shooting through my side. I gasped and nearly collapsed my body screaming, but I knew that if I fell, it would be over. I staggered toward the desk, desperate for anything to defend myself, my fingers closing around the edge of a lamp. I swung wildly, the crash of shattering glass filling the room. Melissa flinched, but did not stop her hands lunging again for the cord. My voice was nothing but a hoarse rasp, my pleas for her to stop lost in the air between us. The noise finally drew attention. Footsteps pounded down the hall. Voices rose in alarm, and the door burst open just as Melissa dropped the cord and collapsed to her knees, sobbing theatrically. She pressed at her arm, hitting herself lightly to raise red marks, then wailed, "She attacked me first. I had to defend myself." Our parents rushed in, their eyes darting between us, and I stood there gasping for air, clutching my bruised throat, while Melissa wept like the perfect actress she had always been. My mother immediately knelt by her side, stroking her hair, whispering, "Oh, my poor baby, what has she done to you?" My father glared at me, his silence as damning as ever. The cord lay coiled on the floor like a snake, silent testimony to what had just happened, but neither of them looked at it. They looked only at her, at their golden child, and their judgment was swift. "Emily," my mother snapped, "how could you?" I tried to speak to explain, but my voice was shattered, every word a rasp, and nothing I said seemed real to them. Melissa cried louder, pointing at me, insisting I had snapped, that I was jealous, that I wanted to hurt her. My mother pulled her into her arms. My father muttered something about disappointment, and I realized with a sickening clarity that even faced with the evidence of my bruised skin, they would still choose her side. The betrayal cut deeper than the cord. I stumbled backward, dizzy my ribs, screaming with every breath, my throat raw. Tears blurred my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them, not when that would only make me look weaker. I turned, clutching the wall for balance, and walked out of the room, leaving them behind with their lies and their willful blindness. But inside me, something had shifted. For years, I had accepted the favoritism, endured the neglect, but now I understood it would never change. Melissa had tried to kill me, and they had chosen to protect her. Yet what they did not realize was that the injuries she left behind would become the proof they could not bury, proof carved into bone and skin that would one day be held up for the world to see. That night, as I lay on the floor of the emergency room hours later, X-rays capturing the damage in black and white, I swore to myself that this would not end the way it always had. This time, the truth would not be hidden. This time, their golden child's cruelty would be exposed, and this time, they would all face the consequences. The hospital room was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of antiseptic, yet to me it felt like a sanctuary because for the first time in days I was away from Melissa and my parents. I lay there with monitors beeping steadily, an oxygen mask pressed against my bruised face, and every inhale scraped against the broken ribs like shards of glass inside my chest. Nurses moved around me gently, speaking in low voices, and when one of them pulled the blanket up to cover me, her eyes lingered on the deep bruises circling my throat. She paused, then glanced at the attending physician who had just entered. He was a calm man with sharp eyes that seemed to read more than what was written on the chart. "Emily," he said softly, "do you want to tell us what really happened?" My mouth went dry. My whole life I had been taught not to speak, not to betray family, not to expose what happened behind closed doors. My parents' voices echoed in my head. "You're overreacting, you're exaggerating, you'll ruin everything if you talk." I shook my head weakly, but the doctor did not move on like others always had. Instead, he leaned closer and said, "I've seen injuries like this before. This wasn't an accident. If you don't want to talk now, that's okay. But know this, I have a duty to report what I see." His words hit me like a crack of thunder. Someone was finally calling it what it was. Abuse. Attempted murder. He didn't dismiss me. He didn't blame me, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of validation. The twist was not just that he believed me. It was that the law required him to act whether my family liked it or not. When the police officer came later that evening, clipboard in hand, my parents were in the hallway arguing loudly with the nurse about discharging me early. Melissa had already staged her drama, telling anyone who would listen that I had gone crazy, that she had no choice but to defend herself. I could hear her voice through the thin walls trembling with fake tears, but the officer ignored the noise. He stepped into my room, his uniform stiff, his gaze steady, and asked me plainly, "Do you feel safe at home?" My throat ached when I tried to speak, so I nodded once and then shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. That contradiction was enough. He saw it. He wrote it down. The doctor provided the x-rays, the photographs of my injuries, and the nurse confirmed the bruising patterns were consistent with strangulation. My parents' pleas in the hallway grew louder, desperate, but the twist had already unfolded. The truth was no longer mine to bury or theirs to silence. The moment they realized they were losing control was almost surreal. My mother burst into the room, eyes wide, shouting, "She's lying. She's trying to destroy this family." But the officer calmly stood between us and said, "Ma'am, you need to wait outside. This is an active investigation." My father's face darkened with fury, but even he could not intimidate the uniform and badge standing in front of me. Melissa tried one last act, clutching her chest dramatically and whispering, "I didn't mean to hurt her," but the words fell flat because the evidence spoke louder than her tears. The twist was not just that they could no longer gaslight me, it was that their golden child's violence had left physical proof they could not erase. The x-rays showed fractures, the photographs showed ligature marks, and my hoarse, broken voice recorded on the officer's body. Cam carried the weight of years of silence, finally cracking. For once, the script had flipped. I was no longer the accused, I was the victim, and Melissa was the aggressor. My parents could scream deny and manipulate all they wanted, but the law had been set in motion. And deep down, I felt a grim satisfaction. They had always underestimated me, always believed they could crush me into submission. But this time, it was their world collapsing, not mine. That night, lying in the hospital bed with my chest bandaged and my voice barely audible, I whispered to myself a vow this was only the beginning. The truth was out now, and I would make sure it spread so far they could never bury it again. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds of the hospital room, and with each passing hour, I felt the tension in the air tightening. Nurses whispered near the doorway, police officers came and went with clipboards and firm expressions, and my parents paced the hall like caged animals arguing with anyone who dared to stand in their way. I knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to drag me back into silence to paint me once again as the unstable daughter who made up stories to gain attention. But this time, I wasn't alone. The doctor had reported my injuries, the officer had taken my statement, and now the truth was rolling forward like an unstoppable train. Still, the idea of exposure, the world knowing, terrified me. For years, I had hidden every bruise, every insult, every broken bone behind a mask of composure. Now there was no turning back. Later that afternoon, a social worker came into my room carrying a folder thick with papers. She introduced herself gently, asked me if I wanted to press charges, if I had somewhere safe to stay, if I was ready for the storm that would follow. My hands trembled as I signed the forms, my ribs aching with every breath, but inside I felt a growing fire. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure Melissa and my parents could no longer twist the narrative. They had thrived on secrecy, but now their darkness would be dragged into the light. The exposure truly began when the police escorted Melissa into custody. She screamed the entire time, insisting I had attacked her first, that she had no choice, that she was just defending herself. My parents trailed behind, demanding her release, but the officers ignored them. The sight of Melissa in handcuffs, her face twisted with rage and fear, sent a jolt through me. It was a picture of accountability I never thought I'd live to see. And yet it wasn't enough. The damage they had done to me over the years wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, financial. They had stripped me of confidence, of safety, of opportunities. If this exposure was going to matter, it had to be complete. When the case hit the local news, my heart pounded as the anchor's voice read the headline, "Young woman hospitalized after brutal family assault, sister arrested." They didn't use our last name at first, but it didn't take long for neighbors and acquaintances to connect the dots. Phone calls flooded my parents' house. Reporters waited outside with microphones, and the illusion of our perfect family cracked wide open. My parents tried to spin the story, telling relatives I was exaggerating, that Melissa was being unfairly targeted, that I had always been difficult. But this time, people weren't buying it. My aunt from out of state called me directly in the hospital, her voice shaking as she said, "Emily, I always suspected something was wrong. I'm so sorry we didn't see it sooner." The validation burned like tears behind my eyes. The exposure went further when the police obtained surveillance footage from the night of the attack. A neighbor's security camera had caught part of the incident, Melissa storming into the yard with the chair, my father standing by my mother's cold laughter as I screamed. The audio wasn't perfect, but the words were clear enough. That's what you get for talking back. When the prosecutor showed me the footage, I nearly collapsed. Not from fear, but from relief. Proof. Hard, undeniable proof. My parents' faces when confronted with the video were unforgettable. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, my father's fists clenched until his knuckles turned white, and Melissa's bravado shattered instantly. No amount of tears or excuses could erase the fact that the world could now see the truth. The prosecutor smiled grimly and said, "This will play well in front of a jury." For once, justice felt possible. The exposure wasn't only in courtrooms or on television, it seeped into every corner of my life. Old classmates reached out confessing they had noticed bruises or strange behavior from me in the past, but never dared to ask. Former teachers sent messages of support. Even strangers online left comments under the news story offering words of strength. My parents always warned me that if I spoke up, I'd be alone and abandoned, but the opposite was happening. The more the truth spread, the more allies I gained. One night, alone in the hospital bed, I scrolled through the flood of messages on my phone. Some were from friends, some from complete strangers, all telling me I was brave, that I wasn't alone, that I had a future worth fighting for. Tears spilled silently down my face as I realized exposure didn't just mean revealing their cruelty. It also meant finally being seen for who I really was, a survivor. Yet, even as support grew, so did the threats from my family. My father left me voicemails snarling, "You think this will end well for you? You're destroying us." My mother sent texts dripping with venom. "You'll regret this when Melissa rots in jail. You'll have no family left." They still believed fear could pull me back, but their words only strengthened my resolve. I had no intention of going back. The exposure wasn't just about punishment, it was about reclaiming power. Every article written, every news segment aired, every whispered conversation in the neighborhood stripped away another layer of the lies they had built around us. They could no longer pretend we were a happy family. They could no longer hide behind smiles at church or polite waves at the grocery store. The mask was gone, and the world saw them for what they truly were. And as I lay in that hospital bed, ribs aching but spirit steady, I realized the exposure was only the beginning. Soon, there would be a trial, there would be testimony, there would be consequences. And this time, I would not shrink or hide. I would stand in the light, and I would make sure their darkness could never swallow me again. I remember the day of the court hearing when everything that had been hidden in the shadows was suddenly dragged into the light. The courtroom was cold, almost sterile. The walls humming with a low air conditioner, but the tension in the air made it feel suffocating. I sat at the front with my lawyer clutching the folder that held the X-ray images, my chest tightening with both fear and anticipation. My sister sat across from me, her hair tied neatly, her face painted with the same artificial sweetness she always wore when she wanted to convince people she was innocent. She glanced at me briefly, her lips curving into a smirk, as though she had already won. She thought she would manipulate the court, just as she had manipulated our family for years. Her confidence radiated like poison. My parents sat behind her, their presence heavy. They refused to look at me, their gazes fixed on her, as if she were the only child worth their attention. I felt the familiar sting of abandonment, but this time it was mingled with something new power. Because I had evidence. I had proof of what she had done, and no amount of favoritism or lies could erase the reality inked in black and white on those films. When my lawyer stood and began presenting the case, the room seemed to shift. The judge's eyes were calm but sharp, every word recorded, every gesture noted. At first, the narrative sounded like one of many domestic disputes, the kind courts had heard countless times. But then my lawyer reached for the folder, his hands steady, and laid out the X-rays on the large display board. One by one, the images glowed beneath the courtroom lights, the fracture marks on my ribs, the evidence of force, the unmistakable damage caused not by accident, but by violence. The silence was deafening. My sister's smirk faltered. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as if trying to find a flaw in the evidence, some thread to unravel. But there was none. It was irrefutable, undeniable. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying the images, then looking directly at her. That was when her composure cracked. Her hands began to tremble on the table. She whispered something to her lawyer, her voice breaking and her shoulders hunched as though the weight of her lies had finally become too heavy to carry. Her face flushed, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. My parents shifted uneasily, their expressions betraying a mix of confusion and disbelief. My mother shook her head slightly as though willing the images away, as though refusing to accept that her golden child was guilty. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes darting from the X-rays to my sister to me, then back again, but he said nothing. He couldn't defend what was right before him. The courtroom had transformed into a stage, and every spectator could see the truth painted across those glowing images. The whispers began to ripple through the crowd, quiet gasps and murmurs. The sound seemed to crush my sister further, until tears began spilling down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away quickly, as though clinging to some last fragment of dignity, but the more she fought, the harder she broke. Finally, she sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking, her face blotched red with shame. This wasn't the triumphant manipulator she had always been. This was a woman exposed, her cruelty laid bare for all to see. For me, the moment was surreal. I had dreamed of justice, of truth finally being recognized, but the reality of watching her unravel under the weight of evidence was heavier than I had expected. It wasn't satisfaction alone that I felt. It was grief, too. Grief for the years I had lost, the wounds I had endured, the family that had abandoned me. Yet at the same time, there was relief, a release from chains I hadn't even realized were so tight. The judge ordered a recess, the gavel striking firmly, echoing through the silent courtroom. My sister wept into her hands, her lawyer scrambling to console her, while my parents sat frozen, unwilling to meet my gaze. For the first time, the power had shifted. The truth was no longer mine to beg them to see. It was undeniable, written in the cracks of my bones. And in that courtroom, it was no longer me who stood exposed, but her. That shift was the beginning of her downfall, and I knew it was only the start of the consequences she would face. The days after the hearing felt like walking through a haze of both relief and exhaustion. I woke up each morning still half expecting to hear my sister's footsteps outside my door, her voice dripping with venom as she demanded obedience. But instead, there was silence, an unfamiliar kind of peace that felt fragile but real. The court had moved quickly after the X-rays were presented, and the ruling was clear: she was guilty of assault. The weight of that word hung in the air when the judge said it, echoing in a way that seemed to reverberate through the very foundation of my life. For years, her violence had been brushed aside, diminished or excused by my parents. But now it was on record, official, undeniable. She was sentenced to community service, ordered to pay restitution for medical bills, and given mandatory anger management counseling. Some might say the punishment was light compared to what I had endured, but to me, it was monumental. For once, she had to face real-world consequences, and her actions were no longer hidden beneath the shield of favoritism. Watching her being led out of the courtroom, her eyes red from crying, her posture slumped in defeat, I realized that accountability had finally caught up with her. My parents, however, reacted differently. They still tried to protect her even after everything. My mother whispered angrily at me in the hallway, accusing me of destroying the family's reputation, while my father looked at me with cold disappointment, as though I had betrayed them by daring to speak the truth. It hurt, but it no longer controlled me the way it once had. Their loyalty to her didn't erase the validation I had received from the court. For the first time, I wasn't the crazy one, the liar, or the troublemaker. I was the victim who had fought back and been heard. That validation became a shield, one I carried proudly as I began rebuilding my life. Neighbors who had once ignored the tension in our home began approaching me with sympathy, offering support in small but meaningful ways. A teacher from high school even sent me a message saying she had always suspected something was wrong but never had proof. Their words couldn't erase the pain, but they stitched together a sense of belonging that my own family had denied me. My sister, on the other hand, spiraled further. The community service assignments embarrassed her, stripping away the carefully crafted image she had cultivated for years. People whispered when she walked by, and some avoided her altogether. She hated being pitied, but she hated being judged even more. That was her greatest punishment, not just the legal sentence, but the loss of the control she had always wielded over others. The consequences followed her like a shadow, one she couldn't shake. At work, she was demoted after her employer learned about the conviction. Friends distanced themselves. Even extended relatives who had once doted on her began pulling back, unwilling to be associated with the disgrace she had brought on herself. I won't pretend I didn't feel a sense of vindication watching it all unfold. After years of being silenced, gaslit, and abused, seeing her finally stripped of power was cathartic. But it was more than revenge. It was a turning point. Her downfall signaled the end of the cycle that had kept me trapped for so long. I wasn't dependent on their approval anymore, and I didn't need their acceptance to move forward. What mattered was that I had stood up, told the truth, and refused to be erased. Justice had been delivered, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to carve out space for me to breathe, to heal, and to begin reclaiming my own life. As I walked out of the courthouse that final day, the late afternoon sun hit my face warm and blinding. I closed my eyes and let it sink into my skin, a reminder that I had survived something meant to destroy me. My ribs still ached, my scars would remain, but the weight of silence was gone. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't thought possible: hope. Justice had spoken, and it had spoken in my favor. The morning after everything was finalized in court, I woke up to a quiet house. For years, that silence would have terrified me, made me tense and alert for the storm that might come crashing through the door at any moment. But now it was different. It wasn't the silence of fear, but of freedom. The echoes of my sister's laughter, my father's rage, my mother's cutting words, those had haunted me in every corner of that home. But now their power had cracked. They could no longer dictate who I was or what I was worth. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, still wearing the bruises and scars from months of battles, both physical and emotional. For a moment, I stared at my reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She wasn't the broken, cowering girl who used to apologize for breathing too loudly. She was someone stronger, forged in pain, but no longer defined by it. For years, I had been told I was less deserving, less valuable, less loved. My sister had mocked me, my parents had dismissed me, and the weight of their judgment had crushed me. But as I touched the faint ridges of the healing ribs under my shirt, I realized something monumental. I had survived them. I had survived the people who were supposed to protect me, but instead chose to break me. And surviving meant I could rebuild. Slowly, I began to carve out a life for myself. I moved into a small apartment across town, one that smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one could barge in uninvited, no one could throw insults across the dinner table, and no one could break my bones just to watch me crumble. It was a space where I could finally breathe. The first thing I bought was a plant. It sounds small, maybe even silly, but for me, it symbolized growth. Every morning I'd water it, watching it stretch toward the sunlight, fragile but persistent. It reminded me that healing takes time, but it's possible. I enrolled in night classes too, something I had always wanted to do but never had the courage to pursue. Education had been mocked in my house. My achievements were dismissed as worthless compared to my sister's whims. But now I chased knowledge for myself, not for their approval. Each assignment I turned in felt like a victory, each grade a brick in the foundation of the future I was building. It wasn't easy. The trauma didn't vanish overnight. There were nights I woke up drenched in sweat, dreams of being cornered or struck pulling me back into the past. There were days I felt the pull of self-doubt whispering that maybe my parents were right, maybe I was the problem, but each time I pushed back. Each time I reminded myself of the truth, the court had acknowledged the truth my body bore as evidence I wasn't weak. I wasn't worthless. I was a survivor who chose to stand. My sister's downfall continued in the background. Word spread about her conviction, and though I didn't seek updates, they found me anyway. Friends of friends mentioned how she had become isolated, how her bitterness had only grown now that people no longer blindly catered to her. My parents clung to her side, refusing to accept the reality, but I didn't chase after their acceptance anymore. That was their choice, not my burden. I had my own path now, and though it was lonelier than I sometimes wished it was real, I was free. Months later, I attended a community event where the organizer asked me to share my story. My hands trembled as I took the microphone, the crowd of faces blurring together. But once I began speaking, the words poured out like they had been waiting years to be heard. I talked about abuse, about silence, about the fear that thrives when victims are told to be quiet for the sake of family image. And then I talked about courage, about the moment I chose to break the cycle. When I finished, the room was silent, not in dismissal, but in respect. Then came the applause, and with it tears I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. In that moment, I understood something profound. My story wasn't just about pain. It was about survival. It was about reclaiming my worth from those who tried to strip it away. It was about showing others that silence doesn't have to be permanent. That day marked the true beginning of my new life, not defined by what was done to me, but by what I chose to do next. I walked out of that event into the cool night air. Stars scattered across the sky, and I finally felt it deep in my bones. I was free, I was worthy, and I was enough. My scars told a story, but they were not the end. They were the proof that I had lived, endured, and emerged stronger. And this time, the story was mine to write.